Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast, the series in which I speak to people about the risks of human decision-making and how we can mitigate them. Now, regular listeners will have noted that very often we can learn lessons about managing human risk by looking at other contexts in which people are doing it. So when my previous guests, Rory Sutherland and Matt Edwards, talk about the advertising industry, there are lessons there for compliance and risk management. Equally, when Jill McDevitt, a sexologist, talked to me about the techniques used to get people to wear condoms to prevent the spread of HIV, there are lessons there for how to get people to wear masks to prevent the spread of COVID. Links to all of those episodes are in the show notes. And on this episode, I'm going to take a look at military decision-making and what we can learn about managing human risk from it. And I've invited two very different guests with very different backgrounds to help me do that. Stuart Tootal had a 20-year career in the British Army, where he saw active service in the 1991 Gulf War and in the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Greg Davies, on the other hand, has a background in behavioural finance and applied decision science. What the two of them have in common, apart from a shared former employer, are some fascinating insights into human decision-making and what we can do to influence it. There's much that we can learn from the military way of doing things. I think you're going to find them an unusual but fascinating combination of guests. So please enjoy my conversation with Stuart Tootal and Greg Davies. So Stuart and Greg, welcome to the Human Risk podcast. Great to have both of you here. Probably to help my listeners, can you just both introduce yourselves and then explain how you came to sort of work together? Perhaps if we start with you, Stuart.
Yeah, Christian, so hi, good to see you here along with Greg. So Greg and I both met each other at Barclays, I think probably over a cigarette and maybe a beer as well. And we got onto the subject of leadership and decision-making. And we talked a little bit about my background as a soldier and Greg's background in human behavioural sciences, particularly around decision-making and relating to investment decisions. Anyway, so we got together and we ended up doing a really successful gig at the Berlin Fund Forum back in 2016, where we talked about decision-making and what could be learnt from the military and transported into the commercial world. And we became friends as a result of that. And I think, Greg, we remain friends ever since.
So far, Stuart. I specialize in behavioral finance and have spent the last 20 years trying to design things that help people to make better financial decisions. And I think one of the primary ways of getting people to limit the emotional content of their decisions is by getting them to follow plans, getting them to pre-plan, to put in place structures and processes, etc. Which is great, and that helps a lot. The problem is that it's only a small part of the solution because, and this is where the connection to Stuart's world comes very strongly, the military has this aphorism that no plan survives first contact with the enemy. And that's true not just in military context. That's true in absolutely every decision-making context that we have. We plan, and our plan meets reality, and our plan and reality gradually diverge over time. And if we're really going to be good decision-makers, we can't just go, I'm devolving to the process. We also have to have ways of keeping ourselves able to make decisions under stress when the plan fails, or when the plan and the reality have diverged. And we have to build processes for how we adapt that plan over time. And this is exactly the set of circumstances that the military has had several hundred years of experimentation on how to help people make decisions under stress in situations where the plan needs to be amended or in some cases completely sort of crumpled up and rolled up. So I think there's an enormous amount that the behavioral science of decision-making can learn from what the military have done through testing and trial and error and experimentation over centuries now.
And it's interesting when you talk in those terms, because I think somebody who's not in the military would look at it and say very rigid structures, a sense of hierarchy, limited room for people to challenge. You know, we all sort of have this drill sergeant mindset when we think about the way the military operates. So when you talk about it in those terms, that sort of seems counterintuitive. And yet Stuart, in the conversations that you and I have had outside this piece, clearly, it's almost, you need precisely the opposite in terms of your thinking about the situation. So you need the discipline within the organization. But outside that, you need some very creative thinking and a responsiveness to a whole range of things that might not be the way you're expecting it to be.
Yeah, Christian, it's a big misnomer, but the military gets things done by hierarchy. But actually, in a combat situation, your leadership, your command structure becomes incredibly flat. And if you think about it, that a young, perhaps 18-year-old soldier doesn't want to risk his or her life because of rank and orders. They want to do it because they've got a faith in their leaders, a faith in the way that they scope a task, make decisions, build a plan together. They've clearly got faith in their team and a big faith in their organizational ethos, which we might call culture. And one of the things which is absolutely part of that is permission to challenge. So I was fortunate enough to command a para battalion, 3 para, as the first UK unit to go into Afghanistan back in 2006. And it was a very early start of the operation. So we thought it was going to be a peaceable operation. It turned into full-on war fighting, which was unanticipated, and it was also unprecedented change. And we were running a particular operation, one of our first operations, where we launched the battle group to conduct what we thought was going to be a very benign operation. So we thought the environment would be very permissive. And it turned out that the intelligence was faulty. To Greg's point, no plan withstands first contact with realities on the ground. And it meant that instead of there being no Taliban in the situation, they actually outnumbered us and very nearly outmatched us. So we suddenly had to recut the plan very quickly. And we used this decision-making methodology that we're all taught. And I recut the plan very quickly, literally running across the field with a few of the bad guys shooting at me. And by the time I got back to my command team, I was able to give very precise, quick battle orders of how we were going to change the plan to still meet the mission. And as I got to the final phase of delivering that plan, which was perhaps the most complex bit, I made the direction that we were going to withdraw to the west from where we were. And my young operations officer, who was a captain, 26 years old, 2 days into the job, stopped me and said, "I disagree. I think we should be better going in the opposite direction," which was to the east. He gave me his reasons why. It was a sound intervention. And I looked at my more senior members of my command group, my exco, if you like, and said, "I agree with the operations officer. What do you think?" And they all nodded. And in a heartbeat, we went with the most junior member's suggestion, and that made for a far better outcome. And that's because that ability to harness the diversity of thought of others was actually codified into our doctrine and our culture, if you like.
And there's something fascinating around what you're dealing with here, which is first is that not doing something isn't an option. So we often think people are very adept at kicking the can down the road. Clearly not an option in that situation if you want to come out alive. And then the second part I think is interesting is what you're dealing with is a human opponent that is thinking about what you're thinking and trying to outfox you. And so this isn't dealing with if you look at something like COVID, it's not sort of a tactical thing that's thinking. No, it's it'll morph, but it's not sort of kind of get itself into our mind. So you're dealing with a situation where you have to take action, and you're dealing with a sentient opponent that is trying to work out what action you're going to take. So that the level of pressure you're under in that situation really challenges our human faculties of thinking.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. And I mean, Greg can relate this to the commercial world, that I think one of the things we face, particularly in the corporate world, and that's been magnified by COVID-19, is not so much about the risk of people making the wrong decisions, because particularly in the financial world it's so heavily regulated. It's actually the risk of people not making a decision when it's needed. And I think we've definitely seen that in COVID-19. We've all worked in corporate organizations which suffer from a zombie-like culture of a frozen middle and everyone delegating everything upwards, people rigid with fear of senior management accountability regimes. And so I think it's crucial that people learn how to make decisions. And if we talk about this distributed environment we're in, where we're working from home, empowering your junior levels within your organization to act on their own initiative, but within intent, is absolutely key to the strategic success of organizations in what is now being called the new normal, which is probably a slightly out of date term because things have moved so quickly.
Perhaps if I could contrast that with what I think we often see in the corporate world, which is a sort of plan paralysis. And you get the situation. It could happen in a number of ways. So one example would be a corporate strategy, a top-down corporate strategy that is imposed by a CEO. But you see the same thing when people build quant models. And what happens is we invest a lot of time and energy in building our strategy and in building our model, and we get emotionally invested in it. And by definition, at the moment we turn that strategy on, it is overfitted to our current knowledge and to the current state of the world. And all that is going to happen there as we learn more about how the world unravels in reality is that your strategy, your plan, your quant model are going to start diverging. They can't get closer together. They can only go apart at that point. And what you often find in corporate strategy is that the CEO deems the strategy to be a good strategy insofar as there's lots of detail in it. So the more lines on your Gantt chart, the more stakeholder checkpoints, the more KPIs that we're measuring, that's a good strategy. And in reality, actually, the more detail in your plan, the sooner it and reality are going to start diverging. And when they start diverging, we get a position of emotional stress because we're emotionally attached to our strategy. We're emotionally attached to this plan, to this quant model, whatever it may be. And if it starts not performing, we get stressed about it. And that is the dangerous situation. That is the situation where, in Stuart's example, there are processes in place to help people recut the plan live in real time in order to adapt to changing circumstances. Whereas what all too often happens in a corporate strategy is we double down on that plan and we go, well, we put so much into it, it must be right. And we will double down and we will stick with it and we will stick with it right up until the point at which it becomes blindingly obvious that it's a stupid thing to carry on with, at which point the CEO gets fired. Everyone breathes a sigh of relief, goes, wow, we'd never do that again. That person was an idiot. And then we rinse and repeat. So we end up in this cycle of plans diverging, and then canning them. That is incredibly costly over time, I think.
Yeah, it's a really good point because I think you look at even lean and agile, where actually lean and agile, which I think increasingly a lot of the data has been indicating they're not really delivering, is because they suffer from a rigid scope mentality. And there isn't this permission to challenge. And crucially, another thing codified in the military decision-making methodology is something called question 2.5, which is in your second question that you ask in these logical steps, is you revisit the tactical situation and you say, has the situation changed? Particularly if you're planning over time. And you also have a control step. And as your plan is absolutely slave to a situational awareness, so everyone has shared consciousness at the beginning of what you're trying to achieve, and then a mission analysis, you've got these various checkpoints where you ask yourself and you ask the team and you red team it and you challenge it. Has the situation changed? So it breaks this, if you like, emotional, psychological attachment to we've got a plan and we don't want to change it. When actually what you're turning around, and I think to Greg's point is, don't sweat the detail too much because everything's probably going to change. But if you've got clear mission purpose in effects terms of what you want to achieve, the detail of how you go about enabling those effects to be delivered may have to change against your strategy. And so this is the great mental and intellectual flexibility of military thinking, which, just as Greg said, has been evolved over 150 years as the battlefield changed. And if you think it changed because of dizzying pace of technological development, a proliferation of non-traditional disrupting actors, and then an increasing regulatory scrutiny that the military's faced, well, those are exactly the same similarities the commercial world is trying to get to grips with, except they've probably been doing it since 2008 rather than 1850.
And I think that there's something fascinating kind of combining what both of you are saying. Stuart, as you were telling your sort of earlier story, There is no shame in deferring to other people and getting their viewpoints in the military. In fact, that's a positive. That's what you should be doing. Whereas in business, as you rightly point out, Greg, there is this sort of thing, like, you're appointed CEO, you better take the decisions here, you better know where we're going. And almost, if you're a CEO and you retreat from something, that's seen as failure. In the military, if you pull back because plan A hasn't worked, that's the sensible thing to do. And there's something strange about the leadership model in business where you've got senior people who sort of, are somehow endowed with this omniscience and this, the reason they're appointed is because they're brilliant, all these things, and therefore we should 100% trust in them. And any deviation from that means that we have somehow failed. Whereas the military model seems to be much more collaborative, and that's built in. And therefore a retreat isn't a failure. It's just another tack on the strategy.
Yeah, I have a wonderful anecdote of that, which I think not only do people get wedded to and committed to their plans, but in large organizations, they start to bake that in to the way people work in such a way that it actually creates barriers to them changing those plans in any way. So in one organization, I saw there was a big transformation project, and in order to get everyone committed to these plans, hundreds of these calendars with 100-day countdown of exactly what was going to be achieved on every day and every week for the next 100 days were printed and airdropped onto everyone's desks. And gradually what happened was, as the calendar and the reality started diverging, initially there was a lot of sort of very loud exhortations to catch up and to do better. And then there was a period of sort of slightly embarrassed silence. And eventually overnight, all these calendars were somehow lifted off people's desks and all disappeared on about day 83 or whatever it was. So when you've got this plan and you're starting to bake your commitment into it, and I know why you do that. You do that because you think it's going to get people behind it and get people, it's going to reinforce awareness of what needs to be done when. But it really, not only do you not have a plan for how to change your plan, but you've made it emotionally difficult for you to do so because you can't back out from it without incurring some hit to your pride.
And the calendar thing's interesting, right? Because you've gone into print and you've literally chronicled so it's a sort of quadruple whammy of things where you've spent money on it. It's there. Everybody can see that it's there. You can see immediately when things are failing, and it's highly visible when it disappears. So if you like, there's a really nice manifestation of the mentality in a physical object.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing about the inflexibility of these things is often the rules that get imposed on decision makers that because they feel that is important to follow due process, are not entitled to challenge or don't feel they're entitled to challenge and can't be bent. I mean, I sat in a room once with 12 very senior executives around a table who were evaluating whether we went forward with option A, B, and C. And I saw 12 intelligent people around the table all agree with each other that over a 4 or 5 year time frame, that it was absolutely incontrovertible that option C was the one to go for. And yet the decision rules of this particular committee imposed an evaluation over a 6-month time horizon. And I watched 12 people choose A instead of C deliberately, whilst all of them thinking that C was the best long-term plan. And these are the sort of things that you cannot make good decisions in a world that is changing and that is adapting and that throws COVID at you, etc., if you are not prepared to have, if you haven't thought through how your decision rules are going to be flexed in response to changes in the environment around you.
Yeah, and I think, Greg, you make this really good point that you talk about the place of process. Now, there's a danger that actually slavish addiction to process suddenly becomes that enemy of creativity. And I think the beauty, if you like, of the military system is that it's taught by everyone. It's taught to everyone. They learn it. They have an opportunity to apply it. So one of the great benefits of the military is they have this thing called doctrine. It's what is taught. But it's a flexible guide or handrail for individuals to use in the process of stress and crisis, and to bring that flexibility alive. And again, I've sort of shared this with Greg before, but we might use this process if we had notice to deliver a large battle group operation, 2,500 soldiers, with a complexity of airspace management, busier than Heathrow at its busiest time. And we would go through this process, 7 steps we would go through to deliver a plan. And we would use all that time, everyone probably briefed, and then we would launch the operation. But if we suddenly had an emergency, a crisis, an unprecedented change to the environment that we were facing, we could complete that same process from a cold start with the same number of people, same complexity of aircraft support, etc., and we could launch them out the door and get them operating in 45 minutes. And that's because we would massively truncate the process we're using. So it was highly flexible, but people were grilled and people were trained. And I remember on one occasion when this happened, my biggest moment, and you mentioned something about pride. And what I would say in the military culture of decision-making, humility is codified within the process. So I was often riven by self-doubt and the big decisions that I had to make on a daily basis over a 7-month period. And on this particular occasion, when we had a nasty ambush, 4 of my soldiers were missing in action. Very sadly, they turned out to have lost their lives. And we needed to move 120 kilometers at speed with about 2,000 people. By the time I went through this decision-making process with my team, and I then confirmed the plan, this is what we're going to do. Broad headlines, it's about intent, about mission, purpose, the effects we wanted to achieve. It was up to my people to be empowered to deliver the actual delivery of meeting those effects. I remember looking around the room, and this was a planning team of about 24 plus people, and said, are we good to go? And there was this stunned silence. And I remember going around each individual and saying, this is a gutsy call. I need to know, are you with the plan? And they all sort of said yes, as I pointed at each one. And of course, my second in command, my executive officer, just leaned forward into me, someone I completely trusted, and said, Colonel, we're good. Everyone's good. It's a good plan. Let's go. And so what I'm trying to get at here is not just the flexibility of process, but you build in those checks, challenges, and confidence building measures where you have got confidence, because my second in command was a contrarian. He was a foil to many of my ideas for good reason. But when he stepped in and said, yeah, we're good, that just gave me that extra level of confidence, not just in the faith in the process and the team, but also in the fact I just had this extra check because we were doing a ballsy thing. We launched the mission and we achieved the success. And sadly, the soldiers we're looking for were already dead, but we got them and recovered their bodies when they might have been taken by the Taliban, which would have been made a bad situation even worse.
And this idea of building structures around human fallibility, I find really interesting. When you talk about having a second in command that is contrarian, I immediately turn to very old structures where I think about, I like looking at sort of medieval structures where, I've probably got my centuries wrong, but things like court jesters, where you have this process of challenge and you've introduced, and there's somebody that is authorized to say things nobody else can say, because the king or the queen is recognized to be fallible, and you need to build this into the structure. And what I think is interesting about what you described there, Stuart, is that, that is something that's often theoretically present in the modern day corporate. So we will have control functions and challenge processes and approval processes, but they don't go to that point, which is people don't genuinely feel able to speak up. So you've got this hideous thing when there's a sham structure, which looks good on paper, but in reality doesn't deliver what you've just outlined, which is genuine challenge.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. You have to have it codified. I mean, and I found this in the commercial world. So I was almost struck by, it might sound like a bit of a myth, but, people would say, be careful of who you hire, because if you hire someone who's better than you, they may be a challenge to your position. Well, I've always found if I've had any success in anything, where it's the military or the commercial world, it's often based on other people, having great people around you. And so I had an operations director at Barclays who could come in, and sometimes he did it publicly. I mean, he's always appropriate, but he would shut the door and say, sometimes, Stuart, I think you got this wrong. You want to reconsider this, or how about a different way? And the key thing about that was I always stopped and I listened, and we didn't always go with what David suggested, but I really thought it through and I talked it through, and we ended up at a better, maybe slightly refined decision or a reconfirmed decision as a result of his intervention. But he knew that in any circumstance, he could call me out. He'd do it publicly sometimes. But everyone looked in on that. And rather than thinking, oh, Stuart's being challenged, he's a weak leader, actually people said he's got the strength and the confidence to listen to other people to help inform his decision-making for a better collective outcome for the group.
I think from a behavioral perspective here, the really important thing is we often say in improving decisions that you need to use process, you need to use plans, you need to almost pre-program your future self, because you don't want to be making decisions from scratch in the heat of the moment. And the issue here is not to throw that out. That is absolutely true. We still need ways of constructing these processes and these systems. But the vital thing here is that you don't just have a process of how you're going to behave in the future, but you also have a process for how to evolve your process, if you like. There's a meta planning point here. And we see this in various areas. So a constitution, for example, a political constitution, is there to govern our decision-making as a collective under times of stress, to make sure that when we're stressed, we don't do things that are against our fundamental principles, etc. But not only is there a constitution, there's a set of rules for how that constitution can be amended and evolved. And that is vitally important. So we should be able to change our plan, our decision processes, our structures, our constitution. But we should also plan for how that happens, because never should I change my constitution or my plan just to shove through a particular decision that happens to grab me at the moment that I emotionally think, oh, this feels like a nice thing to do. My decision-making process of how I change my constitution should be always slightly slower than the decision-making process as well. So there's always that pause point. And in Stuart's case, maybe under pressure, it is only 45 minutes. But in those 45 minutes, I still go through the same seven steps that I use to plan something in a longer position, because that's what gives me confidence that my response to this crisis and this environment is following due process. So the process there is almost how to recut a plan rather than how to plan in the first place. And that also gives you the emotional crutches to help you do things. Because what we often find when people are under stress and don't have a plan, one of two things happens. One is they run around like headless chickens and they do whatever comes into mind first, and you end up, the behavioral bias that comes to hand here is the action bias. People don't like to feel they aren't doing something. So we observe overtrading. We observe people selling in panic at the bottom of a market. We observe people shooting from the hip, etc. We don't want that. But the other opposite extreme of that is we all roll up into the fetal position and do absolutely nothing. And both of those are dangerous. And how do you know where in that spectrum from being biased towards too much action or too little action you should be right now? And the only way you can make that decision is by having some systematic process that helps you to recalibrate to the world around you right now. And that's where these things are so vital. It's not just about planning. It's about planning how to recut your plan.
And I think that's a really interesting depiction, because people often refer to peacetime and wartime, not meaning literally those things, but sort of in the heat of the moment, we'll make quick decisions because we have to, because we're under pressure. And I think there's really interesting, as you talk about the military structures that are there that permit you to know what you're going to do when things start to get sticky and difficult, versus as you point out, Greg, a world where what we'll do is we'll rewrite the rule book in the midst of a crisis, because that's the way that we handle it, implicitly admitting possibly either the rule book wasn't fit for purpose in the first place because it didn't permit these sort of pressurized situations, or you're just reacting, or the rule book's fine, but you're reacting fundamentally. So I think there's something really interesting about building flexibility in a way that allows you to address the framework when you've got time to think about it, but you're not hampered on the ground with your decision making.
And the vitally important thing there is the sign-off process for rewriting the rule book. So you cannot just rewrite the rule book on a whim. You have to go through some predefined set of processes. And this is where the jester, the devil's advocate, the pre-mortem process, the red teaming, all of those tools and techniques should be in some way or another mandated as part of the rule rewriting process, even if we're rewriting rules fast. We need to have those checkpoints. If you're rewriting a constitution, for example, a simple majority vote isn't good enough anymore. We have to have a supermajority vote in 2 houses of parliament. Now, we might want to do that fast under certain circumstances, but you should never cut the corners on the sign-off process, because that's when you're letting the emotion into the decision-making, and that's when you're going to make really big, dangerous errors.
Yeah, I think this is a really good point that Greg makes in answer to your question, Christian, because, and this is something we've got with COVID-19 as well. I mean, people turn around and go, well, it's a wartime situation. What you have to understand about the environment was it was a sustained operation. 24/7, 7 months, all the preparation was probably a year. Yep. So we were exhausted most of the time. Luckily, we're getting 2 to 3 hours sleep a day, incredibly physically intensive, sometimes spike of summer, 45 degrees of heat before even anyone starts shooting at you. So as Greg sort of alluded to, there was a belt full of pressure and risk. But the point about this was it was this mental handrail and guide of how we behaved, how we operated. It was incredibly flexible, but it was a North Star direction. Okay. It didn't actually always have the detailed route map of how we were going in that direction. And that often had to be filled by empowering people to do things with intent. And that's when the process was incredibly powerful as well. And it's that whole collegiate bit and about delegating authority to people. But if you're going to do that, then one of the things I think you have to take into account is, and this is to Greg's point about how do you review stuff? How do you change what you're doing? You've got to have a tolerance for mistakes if you're going to empower people. The crucial thing is you learn from those mistakes. And we used to have, and I use it in the consultancy I run now, with clients. It's incredibly powerful when we look at their processes and we see how you could layer on doing something differently with a more appropriately blended military approach. And that is an after-action review. So every time we did an operation in Afghanistan, we would pull the team, as many as possible, including the junior guys. So it might be the tail gunner in the back of a helicopter. It may be the signals communications command or whatever it was. And we would run through the mission we just completed, and I would give my view, and the operations officer would run the chronology. And as we got to key activities and decision points, we would turn around and go, right, Corporal Smith, you're on the ground there. What was your take? And he said, well, my take's very different to your take because I'm at a completely different operating level. And the stuff I needed to know was it's all very well you sending this communications out on this one system. It didn't get down to me. And I was at the crucial decision-making point. I was a strategic actor, even though I'm a pretty junior person. And we would then turn around and go, okay, so you didn't get my intent. That's my responsibility to communicate that intent. We need a different way of doing that, a different signal. Yet if we're operating at night, suddenly that type of communications doesn't work, whether it's atmospheric pressure, whatever it is, whether it's the frictions, just the stuff that goes wrong, we need to be more resilient. And so we would learn from that and we would codify it, we would share it. And as a result, as a team, we began to improve our performance. We got better because we were willing to accept mistakes, which weren't about negligence. Everyone's trying to work really hard to do the right thing. We would then learn from them and then we would share the lessons. And it was about continual improvement. And it bred huge transparency and huge accountability because people would see this living in action and they felt the need to turn around and go, I'm accountable for why that didn't work. Going forward, if only I knew this, this, and this, I could then do this. And so it bred a very positive learning culture.
And I think that's really interesting because you've got, if you look at corporates, typically things get investigated when they go wrong. And there's a hideous vocabulary. The word investigation is always negatively perceived, and ditto audit. So there is this sense of we will look at if it goes well, we're brilliant. If it goes wrong, we need an investigation. And so you don't have often that sort of, let's look at the things that went well. So naturally, people are in a frame of mind where if they're being asked about what happened, there's a natural presumption the only reason they're being asked is they're sort of a potential suspect in the investigation and blame will be heaped on them. What you've just depicted is a kind of, let's just have a little look at what happened. and we'll talk about it. And yes, of course, there'll be some mistakes. And I think it's important to recognize that no matter how successful there have been some errors in them. But there's an interesting cultural piece there that you've sort of said, well, we'll dissect everything and we'll do it in a manner that's positive for learning, as opposed to we will just dissect things when it goes wrong.
Yes, Chris, and so it's quite interesting you talk about investigations in audits when things go wrong. Well, of course, in the military, all decisions are auditable. So several of the decisions I made in Afghanistan very tragically led to the loss of life for some of my soldiers. And so I found myself in numerous coroners' courts when I came back to the UK, where I was certainly facing risk to my reputation and, more importantly, to my organisational reputation and possible sanction for criminal prosecution. But what was interesting, I can remember particularly in one where there was a very, very contentious death of one of my soldiers, where I had taken a decision which definitely had a causal link to the soldier very sadly losing his life. And this took place in the full gallery of the press, because Afghanistan was very much in the media at the time. And probably more poignantly, the soldier's mother and father sitting quite close to me when I went into the evidence dock. But because I could evidence my decision-making that I made on a very difficult day, the processes we went through, the check and challenges, actually the register of the risk that ultimately led to the loss of this soldier's life. Instead of walking out with a sanction, I walked out with my reputation intact, because I was actually commended by the coroner, who said, you have clearly explained to me why you made the decisions you did on a very difficult day, and I can't fault you for them. Yeah, you had imperfect information. You had to make a decision. But perhaps what was more poignant was when I left effectively the witness stand, I passed the mother of the soldier, and she stood up and kissed me on the cheek and said, thank you for being so honest and transparent. And that one incredibly powerful and poignant moment to me says that if there's one reason for understanding how the military make decisions, is that when things go wrong, and sadly they will go wrong, and you are brought to an account, you can actually evidence your decision-making. And of course, what that also unlocks is this danger of people not making a decision, because they know that they make a decision and it goes bad, actually they can stand up and account for it.
Yeah, I mean, this is essential to allow people to take justifiable risk in an organization. If you are going to be judged purely on outcome, then the natural inclination of senior managers, and I use the term intentionally because in finance we have the senior managers regime, which is a piece of regulation that is there to make sure that senior managers are held to account if they make decisions that are negligent in some way or another. But the issue with this is if you tell a bunch of senior people that if their decisions go wrong, they may go to jail or whatever the sanction is that comes along with this, two things are going to happen very quickly. One is they're all going to take their foot off the gas and stop taking any risk, because why would they place themselves personally at the end of a noose that might tighten around their necks? And secondly, they're going to start building in layer after layer of bureaucracy in order to sort of evidence everything. And the question here is, how do you build a set of processes that is able to hold people to account, but also give people sufficient freedom to take the risk that as an organization we want them to take, and indeed collectively as a society? We can't have everyone just suddenly stopping taking risk. And so this focus on demonstrating due process as being the criteria by which a decision is the goodness or badness of a decision is decided rather than the outcome, is absolutely vital to allowing people to make devolved decisions in an organization whilst still taking suitable amounts of risk. But even worse than that sort of investigate and blame story is when a plan is finally mothballed. It is often done so in a corporate environment entirely in order to avoid that. So, you surreptitiously sweep the calendars off everyone's desks. You get rid of a few people. Nobody mentions it again. There's an implicit finger pointing blame. That was a foolish thing for those people who are no longer with us to have done, and it's a corporation effectively ejecting any responsibility on an ongoing basis for its own past failures. And there's absolutely zero learning in that sort of process. In fact, often quite the opposite, because the organization comes out thinking, well, that certainly wasn't us as an organization. That was those people in the organization who are no longer here. And so it's almost the plan is ended in such a way as to minimize any learning from it rather than to maximize it.
And Greg, it's a really good point. And I saw this the whole time working in a bank, that you would have these great cyclical changes when the CEO got changed or sacked, and they would bring in their new ideas, and then they would disappear, and then everyone would start again from refresh, and we're pretty fatigued by that. There was no concept of having a lessons learned culture. So we talked about, we started in the 1850s in the military experience. That lessons learning is codified again, and it's captured. So, for example, when I went to Afghanistan with 3 Para, I dug out not just the Soviet records of what the Russian army went through, but I also talked, because I knew it was probably going to be a battle situation, with the former commanding officer of 3 Para, who led 3 Para up the slopes of Mount Longdon in the Falklands in 1982, because I knew he had seen stuff and experienced stuff that it would be worth me learning about. And I asked him, I said, what were your biggest challenges? What were some of your failures? What did you really learn from this? So it was instilled this idea of actually capturing the lessons for the past for positive benefit and influence onto the future. And I think what too many corporations do is they airbrush their history. They'll turn around and go, well, that was a bad culture. That was the bad old days. We're now going forward in this way.
We've pivoted.
Saying, what do we learn, good and bad, which can influence the future? Yeah, and it's the product of failure can be hugely powerful as a learning experience, and something that you can take as an investment, as rather than something you want to forget the whole time.
And there's an interesting point around personnel as well, actually. If you don't get in the military, sure, people leave, but there's a different form of turnover there. And there isn't that, fine, if you do something hugely egregious, of course, there are consequences. But broadly speaking, you don't have that kind of, well, he screwed up, let's get rid of him or her, in the same way that you do in business. And I'm really struck by Greg's comment. If we go back to tribal times, the modern business solution is let's ostracize the idiots, and with them we will send those stupid ideas. And therefore, because we've got rid of those people and we've hidden those calendars and those plans, it's never going to happen again. Missing that opportunity to learn. And I think there's something fascinating about the military, I won't say less turnover, but there is something in the structure that sort of encourages exactly that behavior you've just outlined, Stuart.
Yeah. Well, I'll give you a direct example. So when I took over command of 3 Para, I didn't know anyone. In fact, I knew my regimental sergeant major because we'd worked together, but I didn't know anyone. The battalion came with a reputation, had been in the news of the world 5 times in the 5 months before I took over.
For non-UK listeners, that's not a good sign.
I was working for the head of the army at the time, who was also a Parachute Regiment officer. So I was that I was going to have a challenging time. That didn't turn out to be the case. It was hugely rewarding. But the point about that was, if I was in the corporate world, I would have walked in, I looked at my senior command team and said, right, I'm going to bring in my old gang in here. Okay, I'm going to bring all those guys who are going to reinforce my group think. So I've come from JP Morgan. I'm now in Barclays. I'm going to bring everyone in. Okay.
For example,
to ignore the natural historians, which are so vital for understanding how the system works. Okay. And I'm not going to do that on a merit-based basis. In the military, I couldn't do that. I would go in and go, my regimental sergeant major is the guy who's been selected by the system, which is bigger than me, to support me. So is my second in command. Now, clearly, if someone doesn't step up to muster, then I had structures to have them removed or to improve their performance or whatever it was. But I couldn't just go in a whim and say, I don't like the cut of your jib, okay? I was a 1 Para guy when I went to 3 Para, and I felt very 1 Para, but now as a 3 Para guy. So I learned and adapted to the organization, and I harnessed and worked within the tolerances of the people I've been given, both positive and in some cases 1 or 2 were negative. But then I could work on getting them on point in terms of how this 3 Para was going to run forward. And so again, to Greg's point, the structure didn't allow me to come in and be a megalomaniac, basically, at the end of the day. That I had to work within a discipline based on in the Parachute Regiment, it's not quite 100 years, but certainly in the Army's way, of a way of operating, a way of working, which was proven over time. And of course, what that did was that kept me culturally honest. Yeah, that bred a structured integrity. So it didn't really matter what I was like as an individual, good or bad. I had certain structure to work in, which made for a better outcome of how we do business. And because I used the people around me, and I absolutely had to do that. And I think in the commercial world that there is too much of regime change. And it's almost Stalinist in its concept of, we airbrush out the past. 1 minute Trotsky's next to me on the plinth in Red Square, and 5 years later he's not. And you see it. Names are not. It's the mantra of one CEO, which has become almost like a cheap cereal toy falling out of the box, but everyone's talking about it. And then suddenly he's gone, and you're finding his chief of staff saying, "Oh, we don't say that here anymore." It's staggering, absolutely staggering, and sometimes I thought, Christ, we're in an Orwellian sort of novel about animals and two legs good, or two legs bad, 4 legs good, and then 2 legs even better. And again, because that there isn't that structure, there isn't that discipline, that just as Greg said, that, there's huge emotional biases. These senior people come in, they're under pressure, and often they lack a structure around them. We can help them operate in a better way.
That sort of cultural continuity and cultural memory, if you like, is itself a part of the decision constitution. It's the things that are the slowest moving and least changeable bits of your constitution because they're so deeply embedded in the organization. So you could almost think of as culture that is reinforced and gradually evolved over time as being a vital sort of stable leg in your decision constitution of that enables an organization to behave better under stress. I'm just struck with one other thing there, Stuart, where you talk about the time taken to do the after-action review. And when you are under an immense amount of time pressure and sleep pressure, etc., the temptation there is to not do anything that's not moving you forward in a very immediate way. And I think in the corporate world we often see this fetish of optimization. I will strive to do the maximum amount of things with my organization with the minimum number of people, the minimum amount of resources, etc. And I don't know whether this is particular to financial services, but I think financial services is full of economisty type people who like to optimize models. And you get this system where, particularly in good times, our task is to make everything as lean as possible. And any time spent on not moving us forward, on thinking about the past, about the past perhaps, but about the past, is deemed inefficient. And having people around that are duplicating other people's tasks is deemed inefficient. And so we have this fetish of efficiency and fetish of optimization, which is all very well until something like COVID hits. At which point this extremely lean organization that we've built has absolutely no redundancy built in, has no resilience built in, because everything is being done with a knife edge of the minimum resources that's required to do it. And it's interesting to me that the military would encode this sort of redundancy in its decision-making when it precisely is under time pressure of the sort that you speak about.
And I love that, because actually when people talk about, military efficiency, military precision, and so there is this mindset though, and I think if you ask the average person in business, they go, the military, they do very, very slick operation. And actually, it's really interesting that when you look behind it, as you say, there is contingency because you're planning for an uncertain world, and only a fool would go out planning in an uncertain world, running things on a tight shoestring, because that is just a recipe for disaster. And yet you're absolutely right, Greg. That's the business mentality, which is we don't want to be wasting money, wasting resources, wasting cognitive effort on something that might not happen, because that's really stupid. Whereas actually an intelligent bit of planning says, we know some stuff is going to happen that we can't plan for it. So that's going to require us to chuck some money, time and effort at things that are going to, with hindsight, have been a waste of time. But we don't know. It's a little bit like the advertising thing. We don't know which bits aren't going to work and which bits aren't. So we have to cover all our bases.
It's insurance.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, I think, that the optimization obsession is obviously construed with just cutting costs the whole time. And people have stretch targets, etc. I think what's interesting is, the military has to operate with scarce resources. And we never had enough troops to do things. But we had a mindset where we always thought about contingency planning. So part of the decision-making cycle we talked about, called the military combat estimate, had a specified step-back control check where we did the red teaming, and it was about all the what-ifs. What have we missed? What if this goes wrong? What if the bridge we're going to capture, which is so vital because it might be a main effort priority for the operation, is blown up by the enemy before we get there? Okay, we need redundancy. We need a second bridge. We need a boat. We need a different way of getting across that obstacle. And the fact was the contingency was based and baked into the planning as we went through. And often it was the importance of the planning rather than the actual plan, that we thought about these branches and sequels of what might happen. And if you think that if we were going to jump in a vehicle and travel across the Sahara Desert, which is a complex terrain, is full of ambiguity, volatilities, and all the rest of it, and we work out we're going to travel 1,000 miles, we are not going to fill up the tank to optimize it to drive 1,000 miles. Because we're not taking in quicksand, etc. But this is what businesses often do, and they run on this very vapor type approach because there is an obsession with cost. And then, of course, COVID-19 happens. And I think what is fascinating is this debate about, we're so more productive because we're all working from home. Well, actually, what you've now got is a highly distributed workforce, just like we had in Afghanistan. We're spread over 40,000 square kilometers of hostile territory. But that's breeding problems in itself. So people are fatigued. People are confined to their homes. They're missing the interaction, the serendipity of being in the office space, et cetera, et cetera. And people now have to think about, where's the contingency for managing that? This is going to be a sustained activity. Yes, it has some advantages, but it has disadvantages. How do you mission purpose people when you're never seeing them physically from month to month, literally? How do you look after their mental health? How do you empower them so they can get on, make decisions, get stuff done without spending 12 hours on Zoom all day? How do you get your communications right? And of course, these are all very good things that the military can demonstrate an efficiency at. And at a time when so many, and there is an absolute requirement for a shift from management to leadership for people who want to prevail through this crisis in a commercial organizational point of view. But the managers are in uncharted territory. So why wouldn't you want to leverage that very powerful learning perspective from the military, which has spent a century and a half literally existing to operate in this type of environment? Of course, the context is different, but many of the characteristics which we've touched on during this conversation are actually quite similar.
And I think that's a lovely note on which to end things. And I have a sneaking suspicion my listeners are going to clamour for me to get both of you back. So we'll try and make that happen. But I think there is something really interesting about borrowing ideas from other contexts. And very often we double down on, the way we've always done things. And actually, there's some other people, military being a great example, who've been doing this thing just in a totally different context. And if you can tap that knowledge, suddenly you've got a wealth of experience that is highly relevant to your field that might not be obvious. And I think that's come out in spades on this in this conversation. So thank you to both of you. Before we go, can you just let people know how they can get hold of both of you? Because I know there's going to be a lot of people interested in speaking to you further about helping them think about their business problem.
Okay, so I'm a partner in a startup consultancy called Matero. Matero is all about helping organizations repurpose with military precision, with decision-making absolutely at its heart. You can find us on the web, or you can get in contact with me, Stootal, Stootal, at matero.co.uk.
Good. And from my side, I I co-run an organization called Oxford Risk. It's a spin out of Oxford University. We specialize in building software to help people make better financial decisions, weaving in a mix of behavioral science and all these sorts of things that we've been talking about, and as well as data analytics and behavioral psychometric profiling, etc. So oxfordrisk.com, all one word, .com, oxfordrisk.com. I probably spend far too much time on Twitter, so at Greg B. Davies, if you want to catch me on Twitter, are probably the two best places to tap into what we're saying.
Fantastic. Well, look, gentlemen, thank you so much for your thoughts and inspirations, and I'm sure we will find other ways to communicate with the audience, because I think what you've had to say has been fascinating for my listeners. So thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Christian.
Great stuff, Christian. Greg, thank you very much.
So that's it for another episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My massive thanks to Stuart and to Greg for appearing, and of course to you for listening. To find out more about Stuart and Greg's companies and the work that they do, have a look in the show notes. There's links to both of those there. If you're enjoying the Human Risk Podcast, please do try and leave a review on the platform of your choice. It really does help. I'll be back very soon with another episode of this podcast. But in the meantime, stay safe and thanks for listening.